Several wards around the country were contested in the by-elections today. I'm joined now by IEC Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, Masego Shiburi, for an update on how the elections went. Masego, good evening and thank you very much for your time. Let's start with that announcement by the President. Then the local government elections set for the 27th of October 2021. What does this mean then for the IEC? What processes now kick into place?
Obviously, we welcome the announcement and confirmation of the date of an election. It creates certainty among contestants, political parties, the voting public, as well as for us in the election administration. And also it creates certainty amongst persons who are involved in some way or the other with election, be they for security planning or prospective broadcasters of election. So we welcome the date. For us now, we are working towards an immutable, definite date.
Now, various issues were raised here tonight while I was speaking to political parties. I mean, the first one was the ANC saying, of course, they believe the voting stations are one of the safest spaces in South Africa. However, the EFF does not believe so. In fact, they say maybe the inside of the voting station might be the safest space, but outside the gates of those voting stations are people who are not observing COVID-19 protocols. That's one of the claims. The other one, or maybe let's just go through them one by one so that we don't get confused. Let's just start there.
We derived since the by-elections in November last year safety measures for implementation within the boundaries of voting station, and those we developed with the full participation of political parties. We are refining those processes as we learn lessons from by-elections, as we will do today, and we will have an opportunity to once again refine our processes in the by-elections that we'll hold in the November, in the 19th of May by-election. We're engaging with political parties on a regular basis to also receive reports from them and other additional measures that we could consider in order to create a more safer environment for the conduct of by-elections and indeed for preparations for the elections. Yeah. We accept that safety does not only arise on the day of the election. We must also look at what it is that we can do to make the registration of voters safer, and what it is that we can do, what we could introduce to make campaignings by political parties safer.
Yeah. Do you have measures in place for the outside of the voting station where people get to interact with one another?
The law does not grant us authority to deal with matters outside of the boundaries of a voting station. And for that reason, we are only extending our efforts and resources to make the inside of the voting station safer. In the areas outside of the voting station, the regulation, the extant regulation on COVID still apply equally, because it is a requirement that persons must wear masks or face coverings everywhere when they are in public spaces. So we will encourage persons to observe those regulations, but within the boundaries of a voting station, we will have an opportunity to enforce those regulations. In the past by-election, a person who presents at a voting station and they are not wearing a mask, we ask them to cover their face. If they refuse, they are not allowed access into the voting station.
There are reports of ink being removed by a sanitizer today, being raised by the EFF. What do you know about
that? Look, ink is a formulation, and if a person is determined to remove it, by all means, I think they will remove it. We are looking at the ink that we are procuring for this election to improve its indelibility so that it serves the purpose of identifying persons who have participated in election. Ink is not the only safeguard for the election. There's a number of other measures that we're using in tandem with the ink. For this election, a person can only vote at one voting station, and they have no opportunity to present themselves at any other voting station, a situation which is possible in national and provincial election. We have reviewed the ink that we're procuring. We are testing its interface with sanitizers. We are also testing its interface with ordinary household detergents to see that it should be able to withstand those things without making it dangerous for the voting public. Because to improve the ink, you may have to increase the silver nitrate in it, and if you do so, you may just place the public health of citizens at risk. So those are the matters that we are dealing with, and we are confident that we should be able to derive ink that will be fit for purpose for these elections.
Yeah. With a new device that will replace the zip not yet in operation, I mean, are you saying the phenomenon of multiple voting did not occur in these by-elections? You're confident that it would not have been possible?
The allegations of people being able to vote more than they're entitled to, they are overly exaggerated. In a context of local government election, a person registers only in their ward and against a voting district in which they are ordinarily resident, and they have no other opportunity to vote elsewhere. So their name appears only on one segment of the voters' roll, and having presented themselves, their name is scratched on the voters' roll. Their thumb is marked with indelible ink to indicate that they have voted. So in that context, there is no possibility that a person can present themselves twice at the same voting station and also vote more times than they're entitled.
Right. The other issues, of course, are around the voters' roll. I mean, we're at a point where now the integrity of that voters' roll is guaranteed. I mean, I'm not clear on the details, but it seems there is, for example, a voters' roll that seemingly contained over 200 people that are coming from one address. Is that possible?
Those rare instances are possible. For example, if you take a residence at a university, those students will come from a single residence, and in that context, it is possible that the number of voters do not indicate any wrongdoing on their part. Similarly, in a high-rise building, it is possible that you may have multiple persons in that address. What we are introducing for this election to deal with those type of accusation, we will make the voters' roll available for voters and interested persons to inspect it and to raise objections against the inclusion or exclusion of certain persons on the segment of the voters' roll. Similarly, we have amended the law to make provision for voters who are registered but for whom we still do not have an address to supply an address before they are entitled to vote on voting day. So those measures should aggregate to further give comfort on the sanctity of the voters' roll, which is the basis to entitle citizens to participate in elections.
Yeah. So is there work still being done on the voters' roll as we speak?
Work on the voters' roll is continuous. It is continuous maintenance of the voters' roll, especially since the judgment of the Concord in 2016 that we must have addresses of voters where an address objectively exists. But on our part now, because we've improved the address situation from 30% to about 95% of people appearing on the voters' roll do so with an address against their name. What we are seized with is to confirm that the address that we have on record has a relationship with the ward in which voters are registered.
Yeah. Are parties allowed to transport voters to come to the voting station? What does regulation say around that?
There is nothing that precludes parties from offering transport to voters to come to a voting station. And transporting of persons to a voting station should not be confused with the phenomenon known as busing. Busing means organizing people to register in a ward in which they are not ordinarily resident for purposes of procuring electoral advantage. However, providing transport to Masego, who does not have a vehicle, to a voting station when he is registered at that voting station is not something that the law frowns on, because the control measures are not in the transport. The control measures are in the voting station, i.e. the person must still produce their valid identity document. Their name must still be on the voters' roll. They must have not participated in that election, and we do all those checks before that person is allowed to vote. So transporting or providing a person transport to a voting station in and of itself is not an affront to free and fair elections.
And then the disruptions that you could report. I mean, one particular one that comes to mind, which was raised tonight, was the successful interdicting of the one of the wards in the Eastern Cape where those by-elections did not take place. Give us clarity on that.
Indeed, there is a ward vacancy, a ward by-election that we've removed from the list because the councillor who had lost membership has successfully, in the intervening period, successfully challenged their expulsion as a councillor in the High Court in East London, and the court has reinstated him and interdicted the by-election. That does not indicate that there was any fault on the part of the Electoral Commission.
As far as disruptions, were there any? They were reporting disruptions, for example, in Ward 20 and Ward 6 tonight.
In the context of 66 voting stations being active for the day, those isolated instances, we have noted them, but on the whole, the voting public, political parties, and all the candidates conducted them in an admirable manner. So we'd rather focus on the positive lessons that we draw from this while we condemn those isolated incidents where persons felt that resorting to means that interfere with the electoral process will give profile to their grievance, however legitimate they may be.
Right. As far as you're concerned, then, looking at these elections and how they've been conducted, and of course you've got another run coming up in May, does that give you a level of confidence that we are ready for the local government elections in October?
We are certainly learning lessons out of all this cycle of by-elections. The 19th of May is a sizable by-election, which will also provide us opportunities to further refine our processes. On the other fronts, we have concluded the review of voting stations. We have confirmed our choices of voting station in consultation with political parties in municipal party liaison committees. We have now commenced with the recruitment of staff that will deploy and train in voting station to administer the general registration of voters. We will soon commence with the recruitment and training of staff that will be employed to administer elections. Our procurement processes are afoot, so we should be ready come the 27th of October to give South Africans an election that they can yet again be proud of.
IEC's Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, Masego Shiburi, I appreciate your time and thank you for joining us tonight on the Newsfeed Late Night. Sergeant